Bold-faced overhead banners clapped loudly for the whole gale that sliced up the river Stroppy and across the dead bones of the fetal post stranger. The Lion Witch's March never saw the lamb in the late March of 2004, as bleak as the body that lay on the quay, that small piece of no man's land that separated the village of Gore from the village of Aberstropy. The weather gave a further cruel atmosphere to the scene. First light on the quay, and dumpy 20-something scene of crime controller Sergeant Bethan Edwards marshalled the growing natters of excited children, already considering a dead body would be an impressive conversation filler, at least until puberty kicks in and a more than believable excuse for their late arrival at school. A bespectacled, jerky, nerdy little fellow called to Sergeant Edwards, intelligently and enthusiastically from behind the high-visibility police barrier tapes, which spun and sounded like old-fashioned football rattles. "Where's the chalk?" "Chalk?" the sly-eyed cop inquired of the boy. "Well," explained the boy, taking a step forward and grasping the tape with his tiny frozen yogurt hands. "Stand back," commanded the spiteful Sergeant Edwards, as if she was on crowd control duty at the vetch field. "All I was going to say," spluttered the teeth-chattering little fellow, who bravely continued, "that in a country such as Venezuela, the use of chalk in the marking of a deceased person's ground position is really quite essential to the upkeep of preserving a crime scene, let alone one that appears to me to be that of a potential murder. The chalk's on its way. It's late because it has been dropped off at ER school first, which is where you should be now." The young crime analyst turned and slithered away among the slimy, brooding ranks of fur-capped snorkel jackets to Gore Comprehensive School, no doubt to retell of his experience that harsh and unexpected Tuesday morning with an exclusive band of like-minded students. Sergeant Bethan Edwards returned to her position within the quay, smarting at the little fellow's enlightening only to the thickest of cops' comments. She fumed to herself, "Swotty little twit." Sergeant Bethan Edwards winked at a very tall police officer who was assigned to point duty. His mission was to actively control the fast-growing single-lane morning commuter traffic. Without him, the city of Swansea's economy would be surely dented. With him, the city of Swansea's economy would also be dented, particularly in the areas of shoplifting, which was his specialised duty. Occasionally, his energy was expelled upon ushering to a safe place the growing number of official vehicles. Among these were paramedics, gleaming media wagons with familiar logos, and the local mobile hot dog vendor, noticeable by a pink, floppy, smiling sausage with mustard streaming over it to spell the name Frieda's Frankfurters. "Guten Morgen, officer. Have you had your breakfast yet?" inquired Frieda, the 50-something German national who, despite being an Aberstropy resident since 1964, remained untitled as a local. On the other hand, there were Morrison-born long-term Aberstropy residents of over 60 years, also bereft of such a status. The very tall police officer smiled as he called Frieda on, artificial smoke blowing from his dripping nose. He acknowledged Sergeant Edwards with a brief nod, then returned his attention to the oncoming traffic. Within the quay, and near enough for the early, inappropriate muttering of Sergeant Edwards to be audible, hung clumsy Colin Crawford. Colin only had the posture, personality and appearance to hang. He shivered, a short, stocky 30-something with unkempt, dirty, sea salt-thickened beard and hair like an oversized sandpaper block. Clear, hexagonal frame spectacles concealed the full uneasiness of his mistrusting, muddy, grey, piggy eyes. A Gore resident and former pupil of its comprehensive school, it was there he was baptized as clumsy Colin Crawford, the incredulous creature of Corridor C. The naming rights belong to Collins' contemporaries and masters alike, following a combination of constant classroom dismissal and a near-fatal attempt to remove his lumber jacket without removing his rucksack first. Think of American actor Richard Dreyfuss in his role as Hooper in Steven Spielberg's 1975 classic thriller Jaws, and you've nailed him. The short, sandy, unshaven, Lennon spec wearing, Kiss t-shirt clad, teabag smoking Richard Dreyfuss in Jaws look-alike 30-something wreck of a computer hacking conspiracy theorist besotted man hopped as he embraced himself and rubbed his forearms in a fruitless attempt to keep out the cold. Observing Sergeant Bethan Edwards, and with her inappropriate muttering still ringing in his ears, he conducted a character appraisal of her to himself. Was she too fat to be a police officer, but fat enough to be a Welsh woman's rugby international? Or was it the other way around? Or both? Colin's attention was soon spotted by the subject of his analysis. Attempting to avert his gaze from Sergeant Bethan Edwards, Colin clumsily shuffled to the side, tripping on the withered lace of his hopelessly outdated Dunlop green flash plimsolls that smelled as well as appeared as though they had been purchased from the shoe department of Burton Menswear in College Street in 1980. Marching towards the human wreck, Sergeant Bethan Edwards prepared a short statement of inquiry as to who he was, why he was within the magic circle of Quay, and if he had really purchased his footwear in the College Street branch of Burton in 1980, or indeed the Oxford Street branch when the store relocated in 1981. Yes, she may have appeared to be far too young to have retail knowledge of these facts, but she really did hold a gift for useless information. Her thirst for knowledge of both a professional and personal nature remained parched as to the sudden roar of an unseen yet familiar vehicle forced her to stand to attention. Civilians, both in and outside of the quay, ducked and stooped as the invisible vehicle's roar loudened, not that ducking, stopping, or any other form of self-preservation, at least in this instance, would have helped much. Should such a vehicle plough into them at speed, the only resting place for them, in the face of such a grand carnage, would be alongside the poor, unattended, frozen corpse on the ground. Colin, on the other hand, considered the scenario of whether the people within the vehicle were modern-day grave robbers. Assuming that they were, would they still constitute such a position if the dead body had not been buried, let alone autopsied? In a scene reminiscent only of the mid-1970s London weekend television drama The Sweeney, the once distant roar arrived and changed to a screeching halt, following a dangerous and quite unnecessary wheel spin. The clumsy arrival of the vehicle, now positioned tight against the police barrier tape, sent debris flying all over the place. Dirt, dust, small stones and leaves coated the shivering police officer on point duty, the steaming juvenile spectators. Within the quay, the shaking Sergeant Edwards, cold, clumsy Colin, and a third figure, the well-wrapped Reverend Lucy Baker, failed to escape the filth flurry. Most unexplainably of all, the debris covered the corpse, therefore ruining the crime scene. The driver door of the obstinately parked vehicle swung open and out bulged Detective Inspector Jack Sprout. The now senior crime scene officer waddled his way towards the quay, only stopping to abuse the very busy point duty officer, who upon Sprout's arrival held up both lanes of traffic. "Oh, what plod?" inquired Sprout, with a forthcoming sneer oozing from his mean mouth. "You want to slow down, mate, jigging around like a tic-tac man up the White City?" The driver door swung open, bouncing against its hinges of the senior crime officer, with his buttock muscles missing somewhere deep within the bowels of his enormous cushion of fat. His small chubby hands wrapped themselves around the door frame to anchor his ascendance. First to appear were his mammoth legs, knees missing, followed awkwardly by his enormous stomach, shirt placket desperate to prevent his lower buttons from escaping, and eventually one final breathless push, and out of the unmarked police car stood the gigantic frame of 6 foot 5 inches, 22 stone Detective Inspector Jack Sprout. Detective Sprout initially surveyed the whole scene from his vehicle. If not for the slate-grey sky that bitter morning, his posture may be mistaken for an eclipse of the sun. Unimpressed, he lit a cigarette, the perpetrator of the sickening stench upon the permanently stained grubby overcoat which barely concealed his bad suit. His necktie contained screen-printed Disney characters, no doubt a Christmas present from someone who did not like him, which narrowed the list of suspects down to loads and loads and loads. Indeed, Sprout was very familiar with the White City. A Cockney wide boy, an undecorated Metropolitan Police officer, the man mountain was sent to Swansea as a promotion to help lift the seaport town's unwelcome reputation as the place to visit if one wanted to get away with murder. In fact, Sprout came from an interesting family of capital city figures. His father, Albert Sprout, was the Wandsworth prison officer directly responsible for great train robber Ronald Biggs that very afternoon that he went over the wall in 1965 before the facelift on Brazil. 2 years earlier, in 2002, his brother, Johnny Sprout, was the coshed security van driver at Heathrow Terminal 4 the day of the then Britain's largest cash robbery. But the hidden secret was his great-great-grandfather, Edward Teddy Sprout. Teddy was the bastard child of one of Jack the Ripper's murder victims. Had it not been for the Sprout family's solemn oath not to identify which of the Ripper victims was Ted's mother, Detective Sprout's DNA could still be used to assist in at least partially identifying the world's most infamous serial killer. Frankly, London had enough Sprouts for one Christmas, and the other 11 months as well. Pratt murdered the tall policeman who returned his attention to guiding the yelling traffic which was on its way as to a Sprout on his way to the Quay. Detective Sprout, this morbidly obese 40-something, wheezed as he breathlessly raised the police cordon tape. A sound decision, as performing the limbo was way beyond his call of duty. Turning to the mass of mainly young onlookers gathered around the police cordon tape, he snarled officially, all right, on your way, you lot." Rubbing his hands with apprehension amid the jeering crowd, he continued, "The show's over, go on, get ya." The ensemble started to jeer, swear, then retreat. Without introduction, Sprout hissed at Sergeant Bethan Edwards. "So, what do we have here then, Sergeant?" "A dead body, sir," replied a suspicious Sergeant Bethan Edwards, referring to the rigid frozen corpse. His throat sliced with the precision one would expect only from a catering college student who had been removed from his course through the inability to be able to peel an egg. Before nepotism gained him an apprenticeship at his uncle's butcher's shop, which prematurely ceased as he accidentally sliced off 3 central digits from his right hand while preparing a wet quail. The injury cruelly led to his inability to grasp a London brick between thumb and forefinger of the right hand, which caused him to drop said brick on his left hand, causing severe nerve damage and eventual amputation, which led to his inevitable dismissal as a bricklayer's labourer. "You don't say," replied Sprout thoughtfully, his standard issue footwear paddling in the shallow end of an uneven foot-deep puddle of blood. Gazing down at the bloody bath and swiftly across to the corpse, Detective Sprout let out a strangled request to Sergeant Edwards. "Where's the chalk, sir?" stuttered the officer. "The chalk, Edwards," demanded Sprout. Sergeant Edwards shuffled meekly towards her senior officer, attempting to disguise her inadequate performance with a spot of blame-shifting. "Forensics radioed through, sir. They're undermined, and above all, stuck in traffic." "Well, radio them back and tell them to put their bleeding siren on," insisted Sprout. It's broken. They said that the light flashes, but the siren doesn't work. Sprout called impatiently over to the tall policeman on point duty. Oi, plod, speed this traffic up, will ya? The single-fingered salute that Sprout's subject of bullying returned was extremely well concealed within his lily-white glove. Meanwhile, Sprout surveyed the populace within the choir, ignoring Sergeant Edwards, which he found very easy to do. Colin, for the second time this morning, averted the stare of authority. The Reverend Lucy Baker, on the other hand, returned an impassive, holy nod of recognition. Detective Sprout knelt beside the corpse, breaking the ice crystals, first dipping his finger into the puddle of blood, lifting the substance out to allow it to slowly drip onto his fingernail, sending a laboured trickle of the subject's liquid inside onto the floor. The blood cells were now as dead as the poor man on the floor himself. "You see over there," said Detective Sprout to the Reverend Lucy Baker, glancing at Sergeant Edwards, who happened to be slagging him off to her colleague, the one that looks like a squashed Betty Stove. "Remember her? Betty Stove lost to Ginny Wade in the ladies' Wimbledon final in '77. I was a ball boy back then." The Reverend Lucy Baker, a beautiful woman in her early 60s, tall, wry and elegant, eyes deep brown and fixed upon the squatting detective, appeared as impressed as being confronted by the devil after a long and successful career in the clergy, only to find that he wasn't as bad a bloke as she had been making him out to be, or to her parishioners. The good Reverend's failure to appear neither interested nor amused in Sprout's comments caused the detective quite some angst as he sulked into the bloody ice-cracked pool. Rising from his bullfrog pose, he wiped his blood-smeared hand onto the side of his trousers and shook the excess back into the bloody pool. "Excuse me," asked the Reverend Lucy Baker, "are you sure that you're supposed to be doing that?" Sprout slowly ambled across to his inquisitor as if he was more of a heavy grass roller than a former ball boy at Centre Court. "You in fancy dress then, Vic?" smarted Sprout. "I beg your pardon? Fancy yourself as a detective, do you?" continued the aggressive detective. "Hardly, although it does appear bizarre that one should further contaminate a crime scene by adding one's own fibres to it." Detective Sprout was being challenged by the Reverend Lucy Baker, and his reaction was to attempt to intimidate her, firstly by getting into her face, then secondly by asking, "Do I interrupt you when you were working? I have never seen you at one of my services, detective, so it's unlikely that you would have had the chance to." Sprout as Lee Van Cleef and the Reverend Lucy Baker as Clint Eastwood. This really was like that great standoff in the classic 1964 Western A Fistful of Dollars. The tension only lasted for a moment, but seemed like an hour. During this moment, a high, silent tension. A short, diminutive and rather scruffy male appeared from a vehicle parked on the Aberstropy side of the quay. A rhapsodic youth, transitional iconoclastic, with a large virtuoso's cravat made out of his mother's apron and a cricket jumper dyed bottle green, a blabbering, resourceful, act-hard, grandois, emerging adult, a junior reporter from the Evening Post. His specialisation was crime, poetry and plagiarism. Sprout broke the stare out with Reverend Lucy Baker as he caught view of the emerging journalist. "I'll deal with you later," slowly snarled the detective to his celestial adversary. "Edwards, over here and deal with the oncoming hack." He lowered his voice. "I can't be arsed myself." Sprout deliberately turned his back on the Reverend Lucy Baker and walked towards the body. The journalist crept under the upside-down, inside-out police tape which whipped around below the upside-down, inside-out barriers. Detective Sergeant Sprout patted the journalist as he caught up with Sprout. "Get behind the tape, son. It's a crime scene, you mug. I need a word, detective, regarding the 2004 Wales village of Culture Bid." What? Steamed sprout, all red in the face and fuming. As if you haven't noticed, Dylan flipping Thomas, I have a stiff appointment over here. Then the journalist caused Sprout to stop in his tracks and beckoned him over to join him as he called across, I have information concerning the 2004 Wales Village of Culture bid, which may have a direct connection with this very incident. Meanwhile, at Gore Comprehensive School, Miss Long was a dream. The subject of many of her pupils' fathers' desires, the tall, elegant, maternal 20-something stood erect and immaculate in her clinging knee-length woolen skirt and silken principal's blouse, with a long, sharp pencil poked well into the tight bun within the banana comb in her natural blonde hair. The mesmeric effect of her sexuality upon males, and to a lesser extent females, from the age of around 13 upwards and onwards to the schoolyard homes and parental workplace, was unavoidable. Her intellectual and maternal qualities stimulated and soothed the need of her pupils, although her influence upon some of the female students within Class 2A could lead to a confusing state of pubescent pastiche. This was the case with Malmo Harris. Malmo, overweight, check. Hair, scraggy, ginger and uneven, check. Makeup, cruelly advised colour tone and application technique, check. Socks, tatty, post-white, grey, check. And shoes dirty, check. All things considered, Malmo Harris, brainbox, sober-sided and safe, uncharacteristically cast caution to a classroom wind that swept among the drift of discombobulated hormones from its teenage students. Malmo Harris wanted a man. Benjamin, announced Miss Long, her slim black-rimmed spectacles perched seductively on the bridge of her slender nose. May I have my chalk, please? Benny Harper was a real high flyer, perched proudly at the summit of the top stream of Gore Comprehensive School. Benny held onto this piece of chalk, tapping it thoughtfully upon the scratchy top of his uneven desk. The desk he shared with Malmo Harris. Slowly, Malmo slid her hand across the desktop, stopping at her contemporary's hand. She rested her hand upon his and began to smooth and gently scratch his palm. Benny, smouldered Malmo, Miss Long would like the chalk back now. Benny glanced at Malmo, lowered his eyes to observe her hand gently scraping his own, then across to his and almost everyone else's favourite teacher. Miss, may I keep this chalk until the bell? Miss Long deliberated the effect of her response upon her star pupil's concentration for the remaining 30 minutes or so. Cock, barked Anderson, the class hard man, from the rear of the room in the direction of Benny. Thank you, Anderson, exclaimed the erotic educator. Malmo Harris, with her hand still attempting to work its magic on the target of her powerful, newly acquired lust, stared fearlessly with her own sense of menace over her shoulder and directly into Anderson's vulnerability. The bully subsided. Miss Long delivered her response to Benny's request. Yes, Benny, keep it safe and return it to me at the end of the class. Thank you, miss, acknowledged the boy thoughtfully in the direction of his superior. Miss Long addressed her class and announced that his last half hour would be spent discussing the mechanics involving the highly topical 2004 Welsh Village of Culture award bid. Benny attempted to withdraw his hand from that of Malmo's, who eventually, reluctantly, slid it back across to her lap. Thank you, Benny, smiled Malmo. He did not know why his colleague should thank him for anything. He also wondered why she smiled at him and secretly and almost affectionately, as opposed to the usual disdain that was on show from her to him. Miss Long began to inform the class of largely interested pupils of the short history surrounding the Welsh Village of Culture since inauguration in 1999. Benny Harper, usually the first in with a question, remained in a deep state of thought as he tapped the chalk that he was entrusted with minding. The class learned that 4 years ago the newly formed Assembly of Wales announced a quadrennial initiative to help bring significant social and economic benefits for the Principality. The Welsh Village of Culture was designed to be more than just a name, a title. It was indeed a stirring heraldic-like call to arms. It was about opportunity for people to invest the most precious commodities, which is they themselves, to install within the very smallest community a strong sense of ambition and pride which would lead the way, be the forerunner in social and economic change, envied the world over. It was also the opportunity to party for a year. As the introduction ended, the debate began, and the questions soon peppered in on Miss Long, who recycled them with a thought-provoking open-mindedness. Despite the hot topic, Benny remained eclipsed. That was until he felt the sole of Malmo's shoe tap him on the hip. "Sorry, Benny," said the horny schoolgirl with a sigh which led to a fierce glance from her classmate. To his horror, Malmo had sat back in her chair, smiling across at him. The real shock for Benny, however, lay at the sight of Malmo's posture. Her chubby, chapped pink thigh overlocked the remaining leg, which exposed the V of her knickers, which matched the equally revolting sight of her tatty, post-white grey socks. Benny didn't know whether to scream, burst into tears, or be sick. His decision remained as delayed the moment that he noticed a note appear on his desktop. A note hand-slid by Gore Comprehensive's very own Scarlet Woman. It read, "Benjamin, I want you, your secret admirer." Benny squirmed deeply into his uncomfortable chair, attempting to digest the shocking scribe that screamed fear into him from above the desk. Assuming that the author was not Miss Long, the only other female within the vicinity, then it had to come from Malmo Harris. A quick glance to the side reaffirmed his suspicion as he spotted Malmo grinning at him, exposing the revolting sight of her uneven post-white grey teeth which matched her tatty post-white grey knickers and socks. Benny decided that evasive action, which may draw attention to himself, or even worse, himself and Malmo, would need to be substituted by a blend of thinking deeply, which he was earlier engaged in, and actually listening to the debate led by Miss Long. Soon the economic component of the debate became replaced by the social, which introduced the thorny area of local rivalry. This was made even more intense when one considers that the two remaining finalists for this year's term's award were the adjoining villages of Gore and Aberstropy. The pupils were a mixture of children from both villages. Benny, for example, was from Aberstropy and Malmo Harris was from Gore. Soon, history was brought into it. Further local rivalries, sport, and then industry, crime, education, and just when the fun and banter was reaching an extremely entertaining and at times hilarious height, Miss Long forced herself to intervene. The sexpot schoolmistress had to conclude the debate by ticking the oral box of inward investment, county council match funding, and "Mess!" Benny Harper shot out of his desk, causing his chair to topple over. "Benjamin?" The school bell loudly sounded, bringing the astonished classroom silence to an end, and the noisy scramble for lunch break to begin. Shortly the room was empty except for Malmo Harris, who swung single-handedly and provocatively from the doorway, and Benny Harper, who joined Miss Long at her desk. They spoke. "Why would you like the head of your present, Benjamin?" inquired a puzzled teacher as her pupil brandished Miss Long's chalk between his thumb and forefinger. "I think that we are going to need him," claimed the bespectacled, jerky, nerdy little fellow from the quay that horribly macabre, biting morning. Back at the quay, "I have a bleeding enough of people around here trying to tell me more bleeding job," yelled Sprout into the face of the diminutive journalist. "Really," complained the Reverend Lucy Baker disappointedly. "Come along, sir," added Sergeant Bethan Edwards as she grasped the journalist's forearm, ushering him away from the quay. The journalist called back over his departing shoulder, "I demand to be heard, Detective Sergeant Sprout." "Bugger off," responded Sprout, who continued, "Help old Mother Teresa of Calcutta on her way when you're done, Edwards." "Sir," confirmed Sergeant Bethan Edwards as the journalist became unceremoniously dumped from the quay. Sprout walked towards Colin, his final eviction target. "Come along, sir, just make your way behind—" "Detective Sprout," interrupted the Reverend Lucy Baker, "I most certainly will not be leaving this area." "I swear to your governor up there," said Sprout, looking up at the grey sky, "if you interrupt me again, you were going to get nicked." "This poor man," said the Reverend Lucy Baker, referring to the corpse on the ground, "appears to be the very last of anyone's attention here. I have a spiritual obligation to remain by this man's side until a suitably appointed clergyman is appointed and your pathologists arrive. I shall remain here in silent prayer." Sprout reddened in the face, his body tensed up, he frothed at the mouth, but remarkably for the slap-happy Dick, he remained in control of his actions. Instead, he diverted his attention to Sergeant Bethan Edwards, who had just returned to her senior officer after roughing up the journo. "Escort this gentleman away from here." As Sergeant Bethan Edwards prepared to batter the shrimp, Colin stopped her in her tracks. "Me too." "And me too what?" inquired Sergeant Bethan Edwards. Pointing at the Reverend Lucy Baker, Colin replied, "What she said." "Said what?" replied the sergeant impatiently. "I also have the right to remain with this body." "I go for an oily rag," declared Sprout in despair of the scene. Reaching within his jacket pocket for a packet of cigarettes, he walked towards the inside-out, upside-down police tape where he was to be confronted once again by the journalist. This time he was armed with a mobile phone and a smug expression. Meanwhile, Collins stated his case to Sergeant Bethan Edwards. He declared that he also had a spiritual priority to serve the human race in his capacity as the self-appointed head of the Raelian movement in Wales. "Okay," mused Sergeant Bethan Edwards slowly towards Colin. Her thirst for knowledge, particularly at first encounters of the weird kind, encouraged an elaboration from the geek. Colin progressed by explaining that Raelism is a UFO religion that was founded in 1974 by Claude Vorilhon. He continued by declaring that the movement teaches that life on Earth was scientifically created by a species of extraterrestrials, which they call the Elohim. At the upside-down, inside-out police tape, the journalist had eventually broken down the arrogance of Sprout, enough at least to allow him to introduce his theory. He had managed to do this by contacting Sprout's senior officer, Chief Superintendent Nick Barr, who radioed the detective sergeant and insisted that he should listen to the journalist. What started as a gnat's windpipe of attention from Sprout quickly changed to that of obedient and extremely excited puppy dog once the journo had run his theory past him. This feeling became surpassed even further as the name of the chief suspect was relayed to him. He gleamed as both men cast their eyes upon none other than the Reverend Lucy Baker. The Reverend Lucy Baker prayed quietly for the salvation of the poor soul who she crouched beside. Behind her in the background, Sergeant Bethan Edwards was now showing keen interest in the teachings of Colin. She even offered him a stick of her chewing gum, which he accepted gratefully. "So what are the ethics of Raelism then, Colin?" He continued by stating that it had a quasi-clerical structure to which she didn't know what he meant, and neither did Colin. However, he did know that Raelism promoted world peace-sharing, democracy and non-violence. "Drop me out of that malarkey then," roared Sergeant Bethan Edwards in the most uncop-like manner. She digressed. I mean, I can't imagine me dropping a big England second row forward, rubbing her mush in the mud and farting on her head as play continued if I was Raelian. I knew it, chirped Colin triumphantly. Not only did he find someone that would listen to his alternative beliefs, but he was also correct in assuming that Sergeant Bethan Edwards was a Wales rugby international. The rugger-bugger peanut hugger was summoned to join her senior officer, but before her departure promised her latest intellectual stimulant that they could discuss this topic over dinner that very evening, if he so wished. He did as he was both skint and hadn't eaten properly for weeks. A very tall lady, immaculate in her small, smart business suit, entered the quay, where, unfortunately for her, she was met by Colin. "Can't come in here." "Are you the senior crime officer?" asked the new face abruptly. "You'll contaminate the crime scene." "I understand that, detective, but you must..." The tall lady, who was in her early 40s with long, natural ginger hair and pea-green eyes, started to explain before being interrupted. No, sorry, love, I'm not a detective," laughed Colin. "I hate the bill." "Then get out of my way, you little turd," snapped the lady, pushing Colin aside before making an about turn to finish the alien layman off, pointing her finger in his face. "And don't call me love." "Sorry," replied Colin, like a scolded schoolboy. The tall lady marched towards Sprout, the journalist and detective Bethan Edwards, who were deep in conversation. On her way through, she passed the Reverend Lucy Baker, who stood over the corpse in silent prayer. "Good afternoon, Padre," grunted the lady as she walked past, only to pause and gawp at the dead body, to which she made a screwed-up face at. The Reverend Lucy Baker looked towards the heavens and back down to the corpse, asking for permission in advance to undermine the lady in her absence. "Tart," whispered the Reverend. Sergeant Bethan Edwards met the tall lady, who unceremoniously brushed past her and moved on to Sprout, to whom she held out her long, elegant hand. "Mrs. India Snodgrass," announced the lady. "Detective Inspector Jack Sprout, and you are..." "I am the Director of Arts and Culture for Swansea City Culture." "Quite a business, this detective." "Yeah, it's a bit shabby, eh? What can I do for you then?" asked Sprout. "Oh, just wanted an update as to these very sad circumstances," replied India. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Snodgrass," said the journalist. "Merlin," acknowledged India. "Well, that man over there is pretty much dead. He's been murdered," Mrs. Snodgrass continued. Sprout. "Oh dear. Are you near finding the culprit, Detective Sprout?" quizzed India Snodgrass. Sprout beckoned the journalist over as he became joined by Sergeant Bethan Edwards. He lowered his head towards the counsellor's ear. "A lot closer than some people think, Miss Snodgrass." "Thank goodness for that," smiled a relieved-looking India Snodgrass. Colin winked at Sergeant Bethan Edwards, who went rather sheepish, and she, along with the journalist and Sprout, approached the Reverend Lucy Baker, who remained in comfort of the poor man on the floor's soul. Marlin Thomas had revealed to Detective Sprout that he had been privy to information supplied to him by his contact in the high chambers of Swansea City Council. It had been brought to his attention that part of the funding criteria for a successful Wales Village of Culture Award was that there would have to be a project outlined that would impact the community spiritually. There had been a bitter wrangle between the church, St. Bartholomew's, that the Reverend Lucy Baker ministered, and the other three chapels in Aberstrophe. The Reverend Lucy Baker's competitiveness was extreme, to say the least, and St. Bartholomew's project won the right to be part of the Aberstrophe bid. Such was the ill feeling in Aberstrophe. The Aberstrophe bid team almost withdrew their application, but they had gone so far with it that they could not stop now. Her only competition now lay in the shape of St. Luke's in Gore, which was the biggest church in the diocese, very wealthy and very, very connected. In fact, the chances of St. Bartholomew's overcoming an application from St. Luke's were about as remote as the Reverend Lucy Baker successfully co-opting Detective Sprout into her congregation for a month of Sundays, which was nil. Furthermore, Marlise Thomas had spent some time digging into the character of the Reverend Lucy Baker. Interestingly, the journalist came upon an issue of the Ceredigion Daily from a few years ago which read, "Poisoned chalice at St. Catherine's, controversial lady vicar quizzed." Apparently members of the congregation were taken down with stomach problems the very day that a motion was going to be raised in a congregational vote as to the reducing the Reverend Lucy Baker's expenses account. This was the final round of meetings, and whatever the outcome of the vote would be the final say in the matter. Due to illness, only the Reverend and her church warden, Dopey Dillis-Jones, a true yes-woman if there ever was one, and the Canon Lewis, who was rumoured to be the lover of the Reverend Lucy Baker, were in attendance, and the Reverend's expenses account was left intact. She was quizzed by Ceredigion police, but the matter was hushed up with all charges dropped following an intervention from Canterbury regarding negative press. It was not long after that when the Reverend Lucy Baker arrived in Aberstrawby to take her post as Reverend of St. Bartholomew's. Earlier in her career as a student of theology at Lampeter University, she had been involved in an altercation between herself and members of the anthropology department at the same college, which led to 3 of the 4 potential anthropologists to be hospitalised, missing teeth mainly and a fractured cheekbone, and further led to the then Miss Baker's month-long suspension. After having her suspension lifted following the alleged seduction of the Dean of Lampeter and consequent bribery that she subjected him to, she travelled to Kampala, then on to the village of Ngu, southern Uganda, as a teacher. It was there that the then Miss Baker, along with 2 Australian colleagues, kidnapped an American student who was about to loudmouth back home the local practices which seemed okay to the girls, to them and everyone else, but not to her, the daughter incidentally of an American UN official. It was alleged that the young women kidnapped the young American and dumped her over the Rwanda border. After a few days, the young woman returned to Rwanda to fetch her back, but she was missing. They presumed that she had been eaten by tigers or something, so hit the vodka and made their way back to Uganda. The girl eventually made her way to South Africa and later reunited with her family, but could not elaborate or identify anyone in her unusual departure due to traumatization from Uganda to Cape Town. This information proved very welcome to Detective Sprout. There was nothing he would have loved more than to be able to bang the Reverend Lucy Baker up right now. This was looking very promising indeed. "Excuse me," said Sergeant Bethan Edwards, grasping the Reverend Lucy Baker by the arm. "Can you just clarify a few things with us, please?" The Reverend Lucy Baker deliberately withheld a response as she concluded her meditation. "Take your hands off me, please," responded the Reverend Lucy Baker. "Only asking," said the shirty Sergeant Bethan Edwards. Amidst the inquisitive crowd, the nearing clip-clop of high-heeled shoes could be heard advancing towards the quay as the Reverend Lucy Baker and Sergeant Bethan Edwards met Sprout and the journalist. "Just a few questions of a routine nature," said Sprout. "You mean you're actually doing some police work, Detective Sprout?" Sprout made an agonizingly difficult attempt at a half-smile. "You were first on the murder scene." "You were first on the murder scene?" Sergeant Bethan Edwards whispered into Sprout's ear. "Reverend," added Sprout. "Yes," replied the Reverend Lucy Baker. "What were you doing up and about at that time of day?" "Sitting with this poor soul." "Before that," barked Sprout. "I was cycling, Detective Sprout." Can anyone corroborate your whereabouts at that time? I don't know. I saw a squirrel back there, but that's not the type of witness what you were looking for, I expect. Indeed, snapped Sprout impatiently, who continued, Who was the last person that you spoke with before finding the body this morning, Reverend? I spoke with a man at the dating club, and there was a room full of people. He smelt, however, so nothing transpired, maybe a brief snog. His name was Mike. The tall, elegant, gentle Monsieur Lejeune, French master and head of Euro 2 Gore Comprehensive, and the ultra-sexy Miss Long stood behind Malmo Harris and Benny Harper, with their hands on the pupils' shoulders. They were all at the quay. Malmo pleaded with her hero Benny Harper to be careful and let an adult handle things, but the diminutive geek swung under the upside-down, inside-out tape and approached the central characters within the quay. I think that you should leave that lady of the cloth alone, announced Benny. What? Roared Detective Sprout. Sergeant Bethan Edwards attempted to usher Benny out of the quay. Miss Long entered the arena and demanded that her pupil should be left alone. The appearance of Miss Long did much to soften the harsh actions of Detective Bethan Edwards, who patted the boy on the head. Oh, hello, said a love-struck Sergeant Bethan Edwards. Detective Sprout joined the threesome as Colin and India Snodgrass inched forward, leaving the Reverend Lucy Baker to stand alone. Who are you, then? purred Sprout to the leggy lovely. I am Benjamin's teacher, replied Miss Long, who announced, We think that you should listen to what we have to say. Caw, they don't make teachers like that when I was in school. You attended, mocked the Reverend Lucy Baker in the direction of Sprout. Miss Long's appearance did much to soften the approach of their allegations, so much so that Benny and his teacher were given permission to state their case. Benny cleared his throat and began to explain. Not you, Squirt, her, croaked the love-struck detective. Benny Harper enjoyed the soothing palms of his favourite teacher upon his shoulder. Feeling a similar sensation on his remaining shoulder, he glanced up, horrified to find that his soother was none other than Malmo Harris. Be brave, whispered Malmo to Benny. I love you. Miss Long slithered sexily as she addressed the gathering, which now included the very interested Reverend Lucy Baker. She introduced the collective theory that they cannot identify the assailant and subsequent murderer of the corpse on the ground at this stage. This would be for the police to work out. They can, however, easily prove the identity of the person who had ordered the assassination as a conspirator to murder. A long gasp whirled around the quay as Detective Sprout gestured her continuance. Amidst the raised whispers from amateur sleuths and excited onlookers alike, Miss Long continued with the allegation. She very briefly introduced the purpose of the 2004 Wales Village of Culture Award, what it meant to both sides of the quay from a social and economic perspective, and concluded it by introducing Mrs. India Snodgrass as the head of arts and culture and the person likely to distribute the financial award to the specific applicants within the winning village. Mrs. India Snodgrass smiled, then nodded her approval at the accolade she'd just been paid. Miss Long continued by informing her audience that the award-winning body came from the Assembly of Wales Cardiff, and while their decision would be based upon all relevant criteria being met, the very thing that they would at all costs be protective of is the manner of its applicant's approach in order to preserve the integrity of its reputation. Malmo Harris grasped Benny Harper's hand and squeezed it tightly, giving the target of her affection no means of escape. Miss Long continued, Indeed, reputation is all to any major body, let alone a government responsible for what is essentially the public purse. Sergeant Bethan Edwards looked at the Reverend Lucy Baker as if to say, This means you, this does. The Reverend Lucy Baker looked at Sergeant Bethan Edwards as if to reply, Nit. Miss Long claimed that the incident today would be frowned on greatly by the Assembly of Wales and would result in an almost certain disqualification for the competitor, which would be deemed thus. "Oh, stop fanning around and tell us who done it, Tweakle," demanded Detective Sprout. "The person who conspired this would certainly be one that would profit greatly from the crime." "And?" asked Sprout. "The person who actually carried out such a crime would have either a strong emotional or financial motive," announced Miss Long. "Cut to the chase, will you? My tea's going to be ready soon." A look of disdain crept through the otherwise impassive expression that Miss Long carried as she concluded her allegation. She put it to those who listened that there was indeed a person who held a vested interest in Aberstropy being discredited and expelled from the 2004 Wales Village of Culture. Someone who would enjoy personal reward by awarding a building contract to a company for fulfilling her work on a big job, such as the refurbishment of the old village hall in Gore, a company such as Rabbi Snodgrass. Right, Mrs. Snodgrass? India Snodgrass laughed loudly as all eyes turned to her. "That's ridiculous. My Rab doesn't work all over Swansea. He has quotes thrown at him all of the time. Absolutely ridiculous." "So who are you saying did the murder then, Tweakle?" asked Sprout. "Rabbi, is it?" "No, not at all," replied Miss Long. "Hold on a moment," interrupted India Snodgrass. "If I was going to benefit from anything, then why would I discredit Gore? If what you say is to believe, surely I would discredit Aberstropy." "Fair point, sexy," remarked Sergeant Bethan Edwards to Miss Long. "Have you ever heard the military expression that upper-class British officers once used at war? Give me a captain who knows his straw foot from his hay foot," asked Miss Long intelligibly. And surprisingly, everyone shook their head, which allowed Miss Long to look at Colin and conclude, "Such as you, sir." "What?" squawked the shocked Colin. Miss Long explained that Colin was well known in the Gore community for being directionally challenged. Unfortunately, Colin was unable to tell the left from the right, nor even more importantly, north from south. The calamity that it had caused over the years included constantly driving the wrong way in a one-way road, and his rewiring work blew the Gore School science block up when he was there as a caretaker's assistant. "You idiot," yelled Mrs. India Snodgrass at the accused, an admission of guilt exasperated further as everyone stared at her. "We suggest that Mrs. India Snodgrass engineered a situation where St. Luke's Church in Gore would be overlooked in favour of the Raelian Church of Wales, which would have its own home in the old village hall. Colin would have his church and her husband would have the contract to build it. India's part was simply to grant the award money, while Colin's was to take someone out for enough scandal to be generated to put Aberstropy out of the picture. The problem was, of course, that Colin laid the body the wrong way round. With this final piece of the accusation delivered, India made a futile escape run towards the upside-down, inside-out tape, but was brought down by Sergeant Bethan Edwards and a hard rugby tackle from behind. The triumphant officer squatted above the crestfallen council official and farted on her head. Colin begged his innocence as his co-conspirator was being cuffed, and shortly Sprout shackled Colin with a pair of his own cuffs. "You're nicked," declared the detective sergeant. "I'm innocent," replied the tearful Colin as he was escorted away and into a police car to face charges of first-degree murder. India joined him in a captivity in a separate vehicle. "Did a good job there, Tweakle," said Sprout to Miss Long, who thanked him. Pointing to Benny Harper, she said, "It is this young man that needs to be thanked, detective." "Never mind him," said Sprout abruptly, who asked, "Do you fancy a drink later?" Miss Long slowly walked towards the detective, who smiled in great expectation. She paused, then whispered sexily, Why don't you just take that tit off your head and shove it up your bum? A beaming Reverend Lucy Baker looked on as Detective Jack Sprout began to leave the scene with his head lowered to the floor. Sergeant Bethan Edwards consoled her senior officer, to whom he replied, "Get in the van, Edwards." As Sergeant Bethan Edwards left the scene, Sprout looked across to the Reverend Lucy Baker as if to say, "One day, Vic, one day." He turned to exit the scene when he was interrupted one last time with a call from a young voice. "Detective Sprout." Sprout turned, and as he faced Benny, the young sleuth grabbed hold of Malmo Harris and gave her one almighty snog. Withdrawing his clasp from Malmo, he sneered, "That's how you do it." Detective Sprout had enough for one day, but one final interruption engaged his attention. It was not from the Reverend Lucy Baker, who was well within her right to have a go, but it was from Benny Harper again. With one hand in Malmo's, he grasped a piece of chalk that he minded for his teacher earlier. "Here," declared Benny as he threw the chalk towards Sprout, which he caught in both hands. "You never know when you're going to need it, eh?" Detective Sprout got into his vehicle and left in the direction of Aberstropy, while Benny and Malmo went off to go hand in hand, leaving the only person in the entire choir being that of the Reverend Lucy Baker. She was glad that it was all over, happy in the knowledge that the perpetrators had been arrested. Detective Sprout had been humiliated, and Aberstropy had now as good as won the 2004 Wales Village of Culture Award. With a self-satisfied smile, the Reverend Lucy Baker turned to face Aberstropy, but first paused as two metallic clangs sounded at her feet. From inside her overcoat and onto the pavement dropped a ligature and a cutthroat razor. She smiled, kicked the objects into the stream under the choir, and returned to the parish she treasured so much.